The snowy silence of a college campus, shattered by a gunman. He singled out the women, and before he was done, 14 were shot dead in cold blood, while the men watched helplessly, a nightmare that has haunted them every night since.
When the panic is started, you can't really stop it.
This policeman, called to the massacre, would find the body of his own daughter. They're all victims of the man who hated women. This is hard copy for Thursday, February 13th, 1992. Hello and welcome, I'm Barry Nolan. Tonight's top story, the vengeance of the man who hated women. He walked into a classroom, he told all the men to leave, and then he did the worst. He selectively executed the women. Our Doug Bruckner has the story that has haunted every man who escaped every night since.
Montreal, the largest city in Quebec, where the license plate reads Je me souviens, French for I remember. And one thing Montrealers will always remember is this. They call it the Montreal Massacre. It was a Friday in December, the last day of the semester at the École Polytechnique, the engineering school at the University of Montreal. A day that's seared not only in the memories of people who live in Quebec, but in the memories of all Canadians.
This is the sort of thing for us that happens sort of south of the border. It is not something that happens in Canada, period.
Another thing Canadians will always remember is this. The white caskets of 14 young women, the nation's best and brightest, cut down as they stood on the threshold of possibility, victims in the most violent battle of the sexes.
There's just nothing you could do with in front of a person with a gun.
It was snowing lightly. It was actually very nice snow. I remember it was like very, very white. It looked like a Christmas card.
But the cold and the snow were nothing compared to the chill to come that night, the night a man named Marc Lépine came to school. As soon as he walked into a classroom on the 3rd floor, the other students there knew he had not arrived to study engineering.
He entered a classroom and he was, brandishing this semi-automatic weapon, and invited the men, all of the male students in the classroom, to leave the classroom.
At first, the other students thought it was some kind of end-of-semester prank, but then he let them know he was serious, dead serious.
To emphasize his particular point, and I think get the message across, there was a couple of gunshots that were fired in the ceiling.
Then Lépine began to divide up the students, men to one side, women to the other.
The males more or less slowly headed over to the side of the classroom and started actually exiting the classroom.
Some of the men thought they were being taken hostage, but then they got into the hallway. They heard the gunfire in the classroom.
He screamed out in French the equivalent of, "You're all a bunch of feminists."
Albert Nierenberg is a newspaper columnist for the Montreal Gazette. He was in the city room when the call came over the police radio.
When you listen to police radio, you think it's a hoax, you think it's a crazy guy. We didn't think it was a big deal.
When he arrived, there was much activity, but it still seemed fairly routine.
This whole parking lot virtually was full of ambulances, and the lights were flashing, and the whole area turned red because of the flashing lights.
Pierre Leclerc was communications boss of the Montreal police. In most cases, the boss would not be the one talking to the media, but this was shaping up into a big deal.
The first thing I did when I arrived there, I met the journalists. But at that time, I had not yet talked to this officer inside. This is the reason why I told them, just let me go in, and I'll come back and tell you what's going on. You know?
He told reporters, as far as he knew, I don't remember the number, it was a small number, 2 or 3 people were dead. Some people were injured. He did not know the number, and everyone was shocked. Up until then, we thought it was that it was a minor story, that it was maybe a crazy guy making threats. It happens often.
Officer Leclerc had his say and went back inside the building to find out more.
And it came out later and told us the number may be higher, or maybe 6, or maybe 9. And at that point, we were devastated, and then he went back in and we never saw him again.
But the horror the reporter imagined was nothing compared to what Officer Leclerc was about to find. For Marc Lépine had carried out the most terrible revenge against women.
He initiated almost a systematic execution and firing upon the students that were in the classroom.
And Officer Leclerc was about to make the most devastating discovery of all. His own child, Maurice, was one of the victims.
I went up there and I just turned the corner of a corridor then, and I saw my girl there, my daughter there.
But the officer saw what happened inside and what drove the killer. That's next. He walked into a classroom and began to kill women only. He spared the men, but left them with a lingering nightmare. Already 3 suicides have resulted, and a policeman knows he will never recover from what he found at the scene. Doug Bruckner continues the story of the man who hated women.
It was the largest massacre in Canadian history and one of the most disturbing crimes of the century. Marc Lépine, a would-be student of engineering, walked into a crowded classroom and divided the students according to sex. The men went into the hall, ready for the worst. And then they heard the screams and the gunfire.
After he asked the men to leave the classroom, and eventually started to flow out, he fired a couple of shots in the ceiling and screamed out in French the equivalent of, "You're all a bunch of feminists, and I hate feminists." And then he initiated almost a systematic execution.
Marc Lépine had lined the women up against the wall and began to kill.
He was shooting at everybody. He was shooting everywhere. He was not selective in his killing. But afterward, that's only afterward that we knew, maybe at midnight, we knew that it was only girls.
He fired until his gun was empty. Special bullets. Bullets designed to rip a person apart.
It was high, it's high velocity, and once it hits the bone, it just, it goes all over. Yeah. You know, the damage inside was just incredible.
14 women would be dead before he stopped and turned the gun on himself.
For some of the girls who got killed, it was their last day. They were graduating, and it was their last day of school.
But to no one was this perverse spree more cruel than Officer Pierre Leclerc. The top spokesman for the Montreal police walked in to survey the carnage and found the body of his own daughter.
I just turned the corner of a corridor then, and I saw my girl there, my daughter there, lying on the back, and she was on the stage, you know, where the desk is, and in front of the classroom. Yes. I recognized her because of the clothes she was wearing, because she was wearing the same clothes that I saw her the Sunday before. You know.
As the bodies were being hauled off, and as the story of what went on inside began to come out, the first question was why? Why would someone do this?
12 of the 14 women were students of engineering, and that was why they died, because this guy was after women, and they wanted to kill women for the fact that they were studying in a non-traditionally traditionally man profession.
When you separate men from the women and you shoot women because they're women, it is violence against women.
Who was Marc Lépine? And what kind of society could produce a man who hates women so much he would line them up at random and shoot them dead? His neighbors in a working-class section of Montreal began with that same frustrating description we always seem to hear about the most horrible criminals. He was a quiet man. He never got into trouble.
He didn't seem crazy at all.
In many ways, Marc Lépine wasn't different than any regular Jack on the street.
But the answers began to surface in his past. A couple of years before the massacre, Lépine tried to join the Canadian Army, but he was turned away. They said he was asocial. Then he tried to get into engineering school.
He had, at one point, aspired to get into the Polytechnique, that particular school, aspired to, I guess, pursue studies in engineering, and for one reason or another, he was refused.
Before the families could even bury the victims, a letter arrived at the local newspaper, a letter written by Marc Lépine before beginning his murderous assaults. His words are the clearest clue to the emotions that drove him to murder.
The feminists always have a talent to enrage me. They want to keep the advantages of women while trying to grab those of the men.
This was a crime against women. It was motivated by an anti-feminist backlash.
Feminists have always ruined my life.
There's a guy who said he was coming to kill women, and that's what he did.
Even if the mad killer epithet will be attributed to me by the media, I consider myself a rational, erudite person.
When it was over, Officer Leclerc could not return to the Montreal Police Department and took a job outside Quebec City as deputy chief in Sainte-Foy.
I never thought that in my life I would be so much affected by something, you know. Because when you have children, when you raise children, you never think that something like this will happen.
One of Maurice Leclerc's classmates was Anne-Marie Edwards. Her mother was home that night when she got the news.
She had just the week previously, had just made the ski team, and she was very proud of that.
And 2 years after her death, the memory of Anne-Marie still haunts her family home. Her Christmas stocking still hangs over the fireplace. Her picture is displayed everywhere. And sewn into a pillow on her bed, a lock of her hair.
I have this cup here that I just took a picture of, sort of stamp on. I just have breakfast with her every morning, just to keep me going.
And Anne-Marie's mother, Suzanne, has done more. For 2 years, she has fought for gun control laws. Just a few weeks ago, Canada passed strict gun control legislation in memory of the 14 who died that day. A memorial that allows all Canadians to say, "I remember." A memorial to the victims of the man who hated women.
Awful tragedy.